Hey everybody, this is my second digital journal entry for digital literacy and rhetorics. So, for our readings for today, we had readings out of Ayman, Bala, Arrow, Rice, Dofel, and DeVos, and then also uh, the statement on digital uh, community and literacy for NCTE of 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 how digital framework has began in a digital age. Yeah. And so I got a lot out of the NCTE statement. And then also, in this entry, I'm going to be pulling specifically a lot from the Arrow and the Rice pieces. I found those really interesting because I haven't really done a lot with HTML, and for a while I was like, oh, like stay away from that because that's too like computer sciencey. So it was interesting to see the discussion about HTML code and how it is so constructed by society and everything around us, and those two things were really fascinating. To start off with the NCTE statement, a lot of them, what I found was interesting, to repeat myself again, was everything in the digital age was really to become more well-rounded, because they stated that you have to participate in a worked world, advocate for equitable access, dealing with things like, I would say, like disability rights, but also equitable access for people of different races as well, and also as different economic backgrounds and different cultural backgrounds. So a lot of different things falls into equitable access, but also going into culture, promoting cultural sustaining communication, which I thought was also another really interesting thing. So what is culturally sustaining, and can some things that are culturally sustaining be detrimental, or is everything that is culturally sustaining good? Because you do see some things that rise up within the digital age that are sustaining cultural norms right now, that aren't as good or detrimental, in how norms that we put on specific people, how those differ against like norms that we would see in social media, and how sometimes those don't interact and coalesce very much, like how we see so much with the current president of the United States, Donald Trump, how he constantly uses Twitter in his professional capacity of president of the United States, not anything coming from his press office, not following traditional conventions that you would see where the information would first be vetted by somebody, go from another person, and then be written for the president. He's writing it himself, just really spewing out information, anything that he thinks about. So really seeing what are the connections and the disconnections between that digital base in our digital age, but also traditional ways. I'm thinking out loud, like traditional things that we assign to people, and that power and how they're supposed to act, and how he's using that digital platform in such a different way than other people have, that some people would argue is disrespectful to the office. And I think that really goes into what I believe, what was it? I believe it was in, talking about how, like, the digital text as in, like, type, how the deliverance of our, of that type in the written word was turned into a separate body of its own, when it was typed out versus that individual person. And I believe that was, is it Rice? I think it was Rice. Talking about particular bodies, because then Rice also brought up a particular theorist, Bruno Latour, whose main area of interest is actor network theory, and there's connections between, like, different things outside the body and how those interact with the social. It was Rice who talked a lot about the social and the differences between your social body and, like, the body of the text. And I seem to not be finding it in my notes, and I know I wrote it down. Like I wrote down, student and text are different bodies altogether. Separation of informational bodies. So, and then also arguing that hypertext should be treated as pedagogical. So, thinking about those very different entities and how they influence one another. That became really interesting to me, how a block of text that used to be just an oratorial delivery, back when we were dealing with traditional oratory in the time of the sophists, where body and speech were interconnected and one thing. But then we see the development of writing and the development of actual type. So then getting into, like, HTML code and type and seeing how the body is different and set alone from the delivery, and how those can cause issues. Like my example that I had with President Trump. And I had it in one of my master's courses, teaching of composition theory. I remember us in grave detail talking about the Harvard writing proficiency from 1873. I remember us going over like a scanned copy in class of like one of the actual pages of that, and talking about how the standardization of writing began with Harvard at that time and really ingrained in higher education, and how higher education became a way to look at proficiency in writing, not just discussing ideas and how you're delivering them, but also how that deliverance is executed. So there was a third layer to that. And through looking specifically with the Rice piece, too, I began to think on my own about how, with a written text, thinking about, like, the separation between the body, ourselves, and then the text that we are writing. But there is also then a separation from the writing itself, and then also the format of the text, which is talked about. But how the writing, how the format of the text is ingrained in how we grade people on how they write. So, like, dealing with, like, MLA format, that it has to be Times New Roman, has to be double-spaced, has to be 12-point font. And they have to have those touchstones besides what they are specifically writing. But those touchstones are a part of your grade, are a part of how that individual is assessed on how they're writing, on how they're communicating their thoughts. Different from the whole body of the thought of the information, but it's still connected in the proficiency of writing, which is interesting. I think that is a whole nother level up from the 1873 Harvard writing proficiency. We're not only testing writing proficiency now that we deal with computers, but we're also dealing with proficiency of format on top of that writing. So it went from just doing delivery, well, not just, it's hard, speeches are difficult, but having that one body of the delivery, and then shifting from the standards where we start to think with Harvard around that turn of the 20th century of dealing with writing proficiency. So translating that oratorial skills into writing skills, and then how proficient are you in your speech, your like speaking through your writing. And now we're kind of transitioning also into how good are you with your writing through the format and the standards. So you can write really well with your thoughts and ideas and have good ideas, but you can have problems with executing the particular format that has become standardized within academia now, as writing proficiency was being standardized with Harvard in 1873. It would be interesting in kind of like a utopian type world where, I don't know, to think about doing a project where not worrying about like have to cite this particular way, because if I don't cite this particular way, I'm going to be an issue of plagiarism, possibly plagiarize something. I have to worry about the 12-point font. I have to worry about the double space. Just let the student go with their thoughts. Just write. And see what a person comes up with. But it's difficult because the standards are so ingrained that even if there's hiccups along the way, it would be really difficult for an individual to try to write outside of the standard in the format if they're told to just write, because that format is so ingrained in society of learning and education. But it'd be interesting to see what people would come up with if there is like no standards, or not standards, like no format, like the MLA or the APA, or if none of that existed, it was just like, just write a paper. That is really interesting to me, and I think what I really took away is from this week's reading is really thinking about the digital age of the separation of what we would think of ourselves as one body, and starting to really think abstractly about learning bodies and education bodies, and then how those start to parse apart, and bringing up theorists that deal with social stuff. Hey!